Socrates, the patron saint of philosophy. He's known as the patron saint because he gave his life for what he believed. He's also known for saying know thyself, which is know thyself. Many of us would say, well, that's the one thing I do know about. But Socrates would differ. He would say, no, knowing thyself is a lifelong project that one must dedicate oneself to at all times, really. He had a clear sense about what can be known and what cannot be known, and more importantly, the danger of assuming to know something that hasn't been fully established. And so Socrates dedicated the vast majority of his later years to just dialoguing with people, trying to clarify what they meant by their terms, and trying to establish whether what they believed they knew was in fact knowable. He never wrote anything down. Some very wise men never did, like Jesus. He felt like if you write something down, you're seduced into thinking that you know it because you can carry it around. Whereas true knowledge comes by actually living the knowledge. He claimed to know nothing, and when a friend asked the oracle, which is a transcendental spiritual priest type person, asked him if there was anyone wiser than Socrates, and the oracle said no. Socrates is the wisest man. In response to this, Socrates says, well, that's peculiar because I don't know anything. Well, of course, what he did know was that he did not know anything, and that everyone else was living in the ignorance of thinking that they did know something. So in that sense, he was the wisest of men. He was a soldier in the Athenian army, which, of course, as we know from history, they lost to the Spartans. And Socrates felt that this was an important thing that he wanted to try and figure out. Why did they lose? What was wrong with their thinking? Why did they lose to the Spartans? And he felt that it was the democracy, or at least that was one of the reasons. He wasn't a fan of democracy. Athens was a democracy, but he felt it had weakened. The individualism that comes with democracy had weakened the Athenian state. He saw himself as a gadfly. Now, a gadfly is an insect, a flying insect, a fly that stings and can bite and cause a sting. And the famous story goes that a guy named Bellerophon decided that he would just hop on Pegasus, the flying horse, and fly up to heaven and make himself a god. Zeus, seeing what was going on, was incensed by this hubris and sent out a gadfly. The gadfly stung Pegasus. Pegasus kicked, and off came Bellerophon, and that's how we get that phrase, being knocked down off your high horse. And Socrates saw himself as being a gadfly that would help people realize that they were being arrogant and foolish by claiming to know things that had not been truly established. Before Socrates, the men of science were primarily concerned with predicting ends via material means. So you look at the world, you figure out how it works, and that way you can engineer and bring about the ends that you want. Socrates says this is too much focusing on our eyes focused on nature around us and not enough on what's going on inside of us. He felt like we need to ask why we are doing these things and what our motivations are. Instead of simply asking, what can I do to make the sick well? How can I figure this out? How can I engineer this? Socrates wants to ask, should you make people buy? Why are you making people buy? We should have a reason, and it should make sense. He wanted to know what ends that we are trying to supposedly engineer and accomplish, what ends are worth living for, are worth striving for. what is worth desiring, period, compared to what we think is worth desiring. Maybe there is something that's worth desiring that you have to learn to desire. What is happiness? We often think we know, but how often do we attain certain things and it doesn't bring us the happiness we wanted? And so Socrates entered into these dialogues, and he's probably most well known for his contribution of the Socratic Method, which is a way of unpacking all of our terms and all of our assumptions to see if what we're talking about really makes sense. Plato recorded 5 dialogues of Socrates in the. You can read these. They read like a play, where one person says something and then the next, and they're fascinating reading, really. And the logic is a lot of fun to go through. But the basic format to these dialogues is always the same. There's a problem is posed, and Socrates is excited to find a young man with wisdom. This young man has the answer to the problem, and Socrates says, "Oh, I've been waiting all my life for somebody like you. Now, let's see. Tell me the answer." But he, eventually finds that there's a minor flaw in the young man's logic, and as he begins to pull on it, the whole thing unravels. So the young man is exposed as knowing nothing, and so together they agree to continue to pursue the truth. That's the form of all of these dialogues illustrating the Socratic method. And they don't always end happy. Sometimes people like Euthyphro get frustrated and say, "I've had enough of this," and just walk away. But at any rate, this method of dialogue is still used today. The ancient Greeks believed in 3 types of happiness: wisdom, social success, and pleasure. And you can kind of think of these as centered in different parts of the body, in the mind, the spirit, and the body. Wisdom in the mind, understanding, rationality. This is the control center, as it were, that is in charge of everything else. Social success, that sense of personal value. You would feel that, in your heart, as it were. Place where we make decisions and will to do this or that. Well, in the heart, when you get angry, your blood pressure goes up, and when you're feeling happy and relaxed, your blood pressure goes down. And then, of course, there's the lower extremities where we feel hunger and a desire for sex. So there's the pleasure that comes with the feeling of personal satisfaction. But Socrates believed to get happiness, you have to have this perfection of the soul where all 3 of these are sort of balanced and in proper order, with the mind on top being in charge of the others. Well, for Socrates, perfection of the soul meant knowing, really truly knowing true values. And he believed that once you know them, you more or less automatically seek them and begin to employ them into your life. But it's more than just complying to society's norms or enforcing society's norms. He refers to this as just mere social constraint. The way a dog can be chained up and muzzled and therefore doesn't hurt anybody, it doesn't mean it's a good dog. It hasn't learned the true values that it needs to learn. And that's what he believed we needed to spend our life trying to do, perfect the soul. But the problem is that our vision, as it were, the way we perceive and think about things, can be distorted with false appearances, just like this optical illusion of Escher's. Prejudice, ignorance, these things all distort our understanding of what happiness is and what truth is. So we must always work to try and understand and unpack all those assumptions. The unexamined life is not worth living, Socrates said. And when he was brought up on charges of corrupting the youth, which I suppose you would have to say he was telling the youth to try and question all authority. And so as far as the authorities were concerned, that was corrupting them. He made his defense, but they voted to be guilty. And so this meant that he was going to have to drink poison hemlock. That was Socrates' own choice for his punishment if he were found guilty. His disciples wanted him to run away and exile himself, but he felt like, no, this won't do. He's a part of this particular society, and he had to abide by its laws. And of course, running from death would mean that he wasn't a true philosopher, because he believed that in death the soul is freed from the constraints of the physical body, the prison that it is in. In fact, with his last dying breath, he says to one of his disciples to be sure and offer a rooster to the god of healing, which seems like an odd request for a man who's dying from poison hemlock, but what he supposedly meant was that the god of healing finally released him, is allowing his soul to be released, and so he owes one to the god of healing. Well, moral autonomy requires hard thinking, and Socrates devoted himself to it, and that's why we remember him to this day.